The Catholic Mass is a continuation of this deep biblical instinct that we need liturgy, ritual, to keep ourselves online. My fear is we're going to fall back into this kind of easy, moralism. No. The moral law is indispensable. A spirituality of trust, indispensable. But the second half of Exodus, liturgy, sacrifice, priesthood, prayer, all of that is also essential. Well, recently, in connection with an academic project I'm working on, I've been reading a lot of the book of Exodus and commentaries thereupon. Exodus, I think you could say, is the story of how God is shaping Israel as his special people. I've said many times before, God chooses Israel not for its own sake, but for the sake of the world, that through Israel the world might be drawn to God. And I think the formation takes place in three basic stages in Exodus. The first one I call spiritual, second one moral, the third one liturgical. The spiritual formation takes place through the Exodus process. So the Lord delivers them from bondage in Egypt. They're slaves, they're powerless, they can't do it on their own. But by trusting in the Lord, they come to freedom. There's the basic spiritual formation, if you want, of Israel, to learn how to trust in the power and action of God. The second type of formation is probably the one that we're most familiar with in the book of Exodus, namely moral formation. So think of the great law that comes on Mount Sinai, summed up in the Ten Commandments. God indeed tells Israel, here's how I want you to behave. But then there's a third level. I'd call it liturgical, and I'll say more about it as I go, but from chapters 25 through 40, and the book ends in chapter 40, we have almost a complete devotion to the liturgical and ritual formation of the people Israel. Now, here's what I think is kind of interesting. Most of us are rather Kantian when it comes to religion. And again, I've talked about this before. Immanuel Kant, the great 18th century philosopher, said religion basically comes down to ethics. So he thought everything in religion is meant to make us good and decent and ethically wholesome people. Our version of it, and you'll hear this a lot on the lips of people today, is, it doesn't really matter what you believe or how you worship, as long as you're a good and decent person, that's all that matters. Well, that's Kantianism. Now look, is the Bible interested in our moral formation? Yes, and Exodus is massively interested in it. Because if you want to be like the God of Israel, who is love and who is justice, well then you've got to become conformed to love and justice. Hence the very stringent moral formation. So far so Kantian. But see, what again is really interesting, that whole almost second half of the book of Exodus is devoted not to moral formation, but to liturgical and ritual formation. Can I give you just a couple of examples? But it covers almost that entire section of the book. But listen now, as they're describing how the Ark of the Covenant should be constructed. They shall make an ark of acacia wood. It shall be 2.5 cubits long, 1.5 cubits wide, 1.5 cubits high. You shall overlay it with pure gold. Inside and outside you shall overlay it. And mind you, this goes on for pages and pages. Here's a second one now about the ornament on top of the ark. You shall make 2 cherubim of gold. Make 1 cherub at one end, 1 cherub at the other. The cherubim shall spread out their wings above, overshadowing the mercy seat. And again, pages and pages of these descriptions. Fine descriptions of the furnishings within the tabernacle around the Ark of the Covenant. We're talking about a lampstand, a table for the so-called bread of presence, etc., etc. And then a lengthy section, so any priest is interested in this, description of the priesthood, what priests are to wear, what priests are to do, and so on. Here's a sampling. These are the vestments they shall make: a breastpiece, an ephod, a robe, a checkered tunic, a turban, and a sash. When they make these sacred vestments, they shall use gold, blue, purple, and crimson yarns and fine linen. Again, pages and pages of this fine description. Now, here's the interesting thing. There's no indication given in the book of Exodus that somehow these liturgical and sort of sacrificial and ritual prescriptions are somehow less important than the moral law. So we've heard the Ten Commandments, we've heard all of the moral requirements, and then we move right into these prescriptions. And in fact, if I might press it, turn from Exodus, you come immediately to the book of Leviticus, where you have 28 chapters dedicated to temple, priesthood, ritual, sacrifice, clean and unclean. I mean, if anything, the biblical author seems more interested in the sort of ritual, liturgical side than the moral side. Okay, so what do we post-Kantians make of this? We who tend to think, well, religion's all about morality. Here's the first observation. God does not need any of this. So please don't fall into the trap of thinking that God has got some sort of psychological hang-up. God so needs to be praised and requires this kind of fussy devotion because of his personality problems. No. God has no needs. The God who made the whole universe from nothing can't possibly benefit from anything in the universe. It's not as though God is requiring all of this. If you doubt me, by the way, take a look at chapter 1 of the book of the prophet Isaiah and look at Psalm 50 sometime. Both give you a very clear sense of how God does not need any of the sacrifice and ritual and so on. But here's the point. We need it. What is all of this doing? And I mean everything from how the priest dresses to how he gestures, how he moves, what he does, sacrifices, what the Ark of the Covenant looks like. What does all of this do? It aligns Israel unto God. Sin basically comes down to a false form of worship. I make something other than God into the supreme value. All of these ritual and liturgical gestures and vesture are meant to align Israel unto God. If the moral law brings the will into line with God's will, all this liturgical law is meant to bring our minds and hearts and imaginations on line with the divine splendor. And see, all of that is of basic importance to the right ordering of the people Israel. Okay, now you're wondering, why is this bishop telling me all this? Well, because I think it does have a special relevance to our moment in relation to COVID. Now here's what I mean. For good reasons, now mind you, I'm not questioning this for a minute. For good reasons, we've had to, close the churches, and now people are allowed back, but in restricted ways. But there's been a distanciation of a lot of people from the formal worship of the church, from the Mass, from the Eucharist. Again, understandable. But here's my concern. The Catholics might revert to this kind of default Kantian position. What I mean is, hey, look, I've got a basically good relationship with God. I'm a decent person. I've been away from ritual and Mass and sacrifice and liturgy for all these months. Who cares? Why does it matter? If I'm a decent person, a spiritually alert person, why does it matter? Well, read the second half of the book of Exodus. Mind you, too, I speak now as a Catholic and maybe especially to Catholics. Altar, sacrifice, temple, vestment, priesthood, incense. Well, all that you find in the book of Exodus and the book of Leviticus, you find in the Catholic Mass. That's a hyper-biblical grounding. And not just Old Testament. Go to the book of Revelation. What do you find? As the seer looks into the heavenly court, this great liturgy going on, which involves priests and vestments and altar and sacrifice and incense and candles, etc. So the Catholic Mass is a continuation of this deep biblical instinct that we need liturgy, ritual, to keep ourselves on line. My fear is we're going to fall back into this kind of easy, moralism. No. The moral law is indispensable. a spirituality of trust, indispensable. But the second half of Exodus, liturgy, sacrifice, priesthood, prayer, all of that is also essential. So, isn't being a good person enough? Short answer, no. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed that video, I encourage you to share it and be sure to subscribe to my YouTube channel.